Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Here are the first 2 chapters of the enchanting story of Heidi, the little Swiss girl who is taken to live with her grandfather in a tiny cottage in the Alps. In these chapters, you will hear how Heidi is taken up to Meadow Nuncle's house by her Aunt Dete and left there with him. She meets Goat Peter, makes a bed of sweet-smelling hay, and becomes acquainted with the 2 goats that will soon become such a big part of her life. I remember reading an old blue-bound copy of this story when I was a little girl. Certainly, this book was one of the reasons I learned to love mountains and high alpine meadows. Even now, I still find myself wishing for a fresh bowl of bread and goat's milk. I hope you enjoy getting to know Heidi over the next few weeks. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 1. Up to Meadow Nuncle's. A path leads from the cheerful old market town of Mayenfeld, through green and wooded fields, to the very foot of the mountains, whose tall slopes gaze sternly down upon the valley. The first part of this narrow trail has no great interest for the traveler, but the moment it begins to climb, the whole moor sends forth the sweet smells of its plants and grasses until the air is heavy with them, and suddenly the path strikes sharply up and goes straight to the Alps. On one bright and sunny June morning, a tall and stoutly built girl of this highland country was toiling up the road, leading a child by the hand. The cheeks of this small lassie were in such a glow that it flamed even through the deep tan of her skin. Nor was this after all so strange a thing, for although the June sun burned hotly, the poor child was all bundled up, as if for protection from a bitter frost. You would hardly think the little mite was more than 5 years old, but just what she really did look like you could never guess, because she was covered by 2 different dresses. That anyone could plainly see. They were put on in layers, one above the other, and to make matters worse, a big scarf of red cotton was so wound about her tiny form that she did not seem to have any shape at all as she trudged wearily along, in her rough and heavy tramping shoes. These 2 people had climbed some 3 or 4 miles up from the valley when they came to the group of houses which lies halfway on the long Alpine slope, and which is called the hamlet. And here they were shouted at from almost every house, now from an open window, now from a doorway or the roadside, for the Highland girl had at last reached her home village. She made no stop, however, but on her way by kept calling back answers to all the questions that were asked of her, and so they came to the far end of the hamlet, and to the last of its scattering cottages. A voice hailed her. "Oh, Dete, wait a minute. If you're going farther up, I'll walk with you." The Highland girl halted. The child who was with her quickly drew away her hand and sank down upon the ground. "Are you so very tired, Heidi?" her companion asked. "No, but I'm hot," the child said. "You just wait. We'll be up there before long now. Only you must try harder and take great big steps, and then we'll be at the top in an hour," her guide said to encourage her. At this moment, a fat, good-natured woman stepped out of the house and joined them. The child got to her feet again and walked along behind the 2 older people, and these, who were old friends, began to talk at a great rate about the different people of the hamlet and of the many other dwellings in its neighborhood. "Say, Dete, where are you taking the youngster?" the fat woman asked. "That's the child of your dead sister, isn't it?" She's the one, answered Dete. I'm going up to Nuncle's with her, and she'll have to stay with him, too. What's that? The child's going to live with Meadow Nuncle? You can't be in your right mind, Dete. How can you even think of such a thing? The old man'll just pack you and your fine plan off home again, you'll see. Oh, no, he can't do that. For, after all, he's her grandfather, and it's his business to look after her. I've been supporting the child so far, and I'll tell you one thing, Barble. I'm not going to lose such a place as I have now found for the sake of any youngster. It's time Nuncle steps in and does his share. Of course it is, Broad Barble agreed eagerly, or at least it would be if he were like other people. But you know his sort. What on earth'll he do with the child? And with such a tiny one, too. She won't last it out in his house. But where are you planning to work? In Frankfurt, said Dete, and an extra good job it is. My new employers were at the baths last summer. Their rooms were on my floor, and I looked after them. They were determined to carry me off with them, but I couldn't get away, and now they want to hire me again, and I'm going, no matter what anyone says. I shouldn't like to be that child, declared Barble, with a shudder, for nobody knows what's wrong with the old man up there. He never speaks to a living soul. From one end of the year to the other he never sets foot in the church. And when once a season he and his thick staff do come down to us, everybody runs away from him and is afraid. Those bushy grey eyebrows of his, and that awful beard. He looks so much like a fierce old beast that I can tell you you're glad not to run across him when you're alone. Suppose he does look strange, said Dete defiantly. He's her grandfather just the same, and has to take care of the child. He probably won't do her any harm, and if he does, he will have to answer for it, not I. And still, the prying Barble said, I'd awfully like to know what sin is on the old man's conscience. Why does he frown so? Why does he live up there on the mountain meadow, shut off from all the world? Why does he almost never show himself among people? They tell all sorts of stories about him, but I suppose you've heard them all from your sister, haven't you, Dete? Indeed I have, but that's my business. If he found that I'd been gossiping, I'd get myself into trouble. Barble had for ever so long been curious to know what was the matter with Meadow Nuncle. Why did he glare at people as if he hated them? Why did he live on the mountain like a hermit? Why did folks always speak of him curtly, as if they did not want to be against him, and still were afraid to speak a good word for him? Barble also thought it queer that all the people in the hamlet should call the old man Meadow Nuncle, for of course he could not be the real uncle of every one of them. But because they called him that, she followed their lead, and never spoke of him except as Nuncle, which was the local way of saying uncle. Just a little while before our story opens, Barble had married and come to the hamlet from her girlhood home in Pratergau, and this is why she did not yet know all the strange things that had happened in the small village, and all about its odd characters and surroundings. Her friend Dete, however, had been born in the hamlet, and had lived there with her mother until the old lady had died the year before. Then Dete had gone to work in a summer resort as a chambermaid in a great hotel, and this morning she had come back with the child from the resort. They had ridden as far as Mayenfeld on a hay cart, which a friend of hers was driving home, and he had been glad to give her and the little one a lift. Barble was not the one to let so good a chance to learn about things slip, so she took tight hold of Dete's arm and said slyly, You see, dearie, one can get the truth from you about what people are saying, because of course you know the whole story. Do tell me what's wrong with the old fellow. Was he always so feared? Did he always hate everybody so? How do I know how he used to be? I'm only 26 years old, and he's 70 at least. You can't expect me to have seen him when he was young. Still, if I knew it wouldn't be gossiped all over Pratergau afterward, I could tell you a few things, believe me. Bah! Dete, what are you afraid of? Asked Barble, a little offended. Don't be so hard on the poor gossips down in Pratergau. And I guess I can keep a secret if I have to. Go on and tell me. That's a good girl. You won't be sorry for it. All right, then I will. But see that you keep your promise, Dete warned her. First she turned around to make sure the child was not close enough to hear what she was going to say. But the youngster was nowhere to be seen. She must have stopped some time before this. Only the two companions had been too interested in their chattering to notice the fact. Although the footpath made several windings, one could still see most of the way down to the hamlet, and there was no one in sight. "Oh, now I see her," cried Barbel. "Look, over yonder." And she pointed far to one side of the mountain trail. "She's climbing the slope with the young goatherd Peter and his goats. I wonder why he's bringing his beast so late today. But it's all right. He can look after the child, and you can tell me all the better about things." "Peter won't have any trouble with her," said Dete. "She's anything but stupid for a 5-year-old. She has her eyes open, and she sees what's going on in the world. I tell you, she'll do the old man good, for he has nothing left but his 2 goats and the thatch on the mountain meadow." "He used to have more, didn't he?" asked Barbel. "I should say he did," answered Dete eagerly. "He owned one of the finest farms around. He was the elder son, and had only one brother who was a quiet and steady fellow. Now, Nuncle wanted to do nothing except play the gentleman, travel around the country, and be friends with bad people, whom nobody else wanted to know. He gambled and drank until the farm was all gone, and then the news came that his father and mother had died, one right after the other because of their grief. And the brother, who had been made a beggar, got angry and ran away. Nobody knew where. And Nuncle himself disappeared, leaving nothing but a bad name behind him. Where had he fled to? They weren't sure. Some said he went off with the army to Naples. Anyway, nothing more was heard from him for almost 15 years. And then suddenly he appeared one day with a half-grown boy, whom he tried to leave with his relatives." "And they took the little lad in, did they, Dete?" Barbel asked excitedly. "Not they. Every door was closed against Nuncle. No one wanted to have any dealings with him. This made him very bitter. He swore he would never set foot in town again, and he came up here to the hamlet to live with his boy. The mother must have been some Swiss girl that he had met down below, and soon lost again. But Dete, the man had no money. There must have been some money left, for he had the boy Tobias learn how to be a carpenter. Tobias was a nice lad and well liked by all the people in the hamlet, but nobody placed any trust in the father. They said he had run away from the army in Naples, and that he would have been put in jail if he had not fled, because he had killed a man, not in war, of course, but in a fight. Still, we had to speak to him, since my mother's grandmother and his had been sisters, so we called him Nuncle, and because through our father we're related to almost all the folks in the hamlet, they called him the same, and that's why ever since he moved up to the mountain pasture, he has been known as Meadow Nuncle." "But what became of Tobias?" Barbel asked curiously. "Have a little patience and you'll hear," said Dete. "I can't tell you everything all at once. Well, Tobias was an apprentice off in Mells, and when his term was over, he came home to the hamlet and married my sister Adelheid, for they had always been fond of each other, and they got along finely after their marriage, but it did not last very long. Not more than 2 years later, when Tobias was helping to build a house, a beam fell on him and killed him. When they brought her husband home so badly hurt, Adelheid's grief threw her into a violent fever, from which she never quite recovered. She was never very strong after that. She was so weak that often you could scarcely tell whether she was awake or sleeping. A few weeks after the death of Tobias, they buried Adelheid too." "People must have pitied Nuncle then," said Barbel. "Oh, no, they didn't. Far and near everyone was talking of the sad fate of the young couple, and they said, as well as hinted, that this was the punishment which Nuncle got because of his godless life. They told him to his face, too. The pastor had a straight talk with him about begging God for forgiveness. But Nuncle just grew more sullen, and no longer had a good word for anybody. They took good care to avoid him anyway. And is that why he left the hamlet, Dete? I suppose. Suddenly it was reported that Nuncle had gone up to the mountain meadow and swore never to come down again. And since that time, there he has stuck, and lived at odds with God and men. Mother and I took Adelheid's child in with us. It was a year old, and when Mother died last summer, I wanted to earn my living down at the baths. So I took the child along, and put her out to board at old Ursula's, up in Pfeffersdorf. It turned out that I could stay at the baths during the winter, for there was a lot of work to do because I knew how to sew and mend. And you met your new employers there? Yes, they came from Frankfurt again, early last spring. They were the ones I waited on the previous year, and who wanted to take me back with them. Day after tomorrow we go, and the place is a good one, I'll tell you that. And you're leaving the child with the old man up there? Oh, Dete, I wonder what you can be thinking of, Barbel said in a tone of deep reproach. And why not? Dete demanded. I guess I've done my duty by the child. And what else is there left for me to do now? I surely can't take a youngster 5 years old to Frankfurt. But where are you going, Barbel? We're hardly halfway up to the meadow. Why, I'm right where I started for, Barbel answered. I must have a talk with Goat Peter's mother. She's to spin for me this winter, so goodbye, Dete, and good luck. Dete gave her hand to Barbel, and then stood watching her as she walked toward the small, dark brown hut, which stood a few steps to one side of the mountain trail, in a hollow that protected it somewhat from the wild winds. The hut was situated halfway up to the summit pasture, if one measured the distance from the hamlet. And it was a good thing that it stood in a sheltered nook of the mountainside, for it did look so shaky and tumble down that it must have been dangerous to live in it when the storm winds blew so madly across the Alps that doors and windows rattled. At such a time, all the decaying timbers of the cottage trembled and creaked. If the little house had stood out on the level pasture, it would surely have been swept down into the valley far below. In this hut dwelt Goat Peter. This was the 11-year-old boy who each morning went down to the hamlet to fetch the villagers' goats. He drove them to the highland pastures, where they could graze on the short meadow grass of the slopes until evening came. Then Peter would run down the slopes again with his nimble flock, would pause at the edge of the hamlet to whistle shrilly through his fingers, and each owner would come to the village green to get his own goat. It was usually the small boys and girls who would be sent on this errand, for there was nothing to fear from the gentle little animals, and these short moments at sunset were the only time during the whole summer when Peter associated with his playmates. The rest of the days he spent with his goats. To be sure, his mother and blind grandmother lived with him at home, but as he was forced to leave the hut very early in the morning, and never return to it until late in the evening, spending as he did every minute possible in play with the hamlet children, he saw but little of his home. In fact, there was just enough time to swallow his bowl of bread and milk at dawn, and again at dusk, and then off to his cottage for sleep. His father, like himself, had been called Goat Peter, because in his childhood years he had also tended the flock. But some years before this he had been killed by a falling tree, which he was chopping down. The real name of young Peter's mother was Brigida, but because of family associations, everybody called her Goat Peter's wife, and the blind grandmother was known to old and young just as grandmother. Now, Dete had been waiting some 10 minutes or more to see if she could find the children. She had climbed a little higher to a spot where she had a better view of the downward sweep of the meadowlands, and from this new place She peered about her in every direction. She was becoming very impatient, for the youngsters were coming slowly the long way around. Peter knew many a hidden spot where there were shrubs and bushes good for his goats to nibble at, so he and his herd were taking their own time and not hurrying. At first, Heidi had tramped painfully along after Peter, for the heat made her gasp, and her heavy clothes were so uncomfortable that it took all her strength to keep up with the boy. She said nothing, but she kept eyeing the young goatherd, who with bare feet and in thin trousers was jumping about here and there without the least effort. And then she looked at the goats, whose slender legs were climbing so lightly over the thin bushes and the rocks of the steep cliffs. Suddenly Heidi sat down on the ground, peeled off her shoes and stockings quickly, pulled the thick red scarf away from her throat, and unbuttoned her little dress to wriggle hurriedly out of it. But this, alas, was not all she had to do. There was another dress for her to unhook, because Auntie Dete, in order to make short work of dressing Heidi and to avoid an extra bundle, had drawn the child's Sunday clothes on over her everyday ones. Quick as light, the old gown was off too, and now Heidi stood dressed only in her thin little underskirt and her blouse, and was stretching her bare arms happily forth from her short sleeves. Then she rolled her things up in a neat bundle, and leaped and climbed after the goats at Peter's side, as light of foot as any in all the company. Peter had paid no heed to what the child was doing when she had fallen behind, but later, when he saw her running along after him in her new costume, his whole face twisted into a merry grin as he turned around to look, and when he caught sight of the small heap of clothes lying down below, his grin became, if possible, even wider still, and his mouth seemed to reach clear from one ear to the other. But he said nothing. Now that Heidi felt so much more easy and comfortable, the two children started to talk with each other. Peter had many a question to answer, for Heidi wished to know how many goats he had, and where he was going with them, and what was he going to do when he got there. And so it was that they and the goats at last arrived at the hut and came to the sight of Aunt Dete. The moment Dete saw this straggling company, she cried, "Heidi, whatever are you doing? My, how you do look! Where is your Sunday dress, and the other dress, and your scarf? And the brand new shoes I bought you, and the new stockings I knit for you? They're gone, every one of them. What have you done with them all?" The little girl pointed calmly down the mountainside and said, "There they are." The aunt looked where she was pointing. Sure enough, something was lying there, and on top of it was a red spot. That must be the scarf. "You naughty little imp!" the aunt cried in great vexation. "What got into your head, Heidi? Why did you take your things off? What do you mean by such actions?" "I don't need them," the child said. Nor did she seem to be sorry in the least for her deed. "You wretched, silly Heidi, where is your common sense?" her auntie went on to scold her. "Who's to go down and run and get them more than a mile away? Quick, Peter, run and fetch the things for me, and don't stand there goggling as if you were stuck fast to the ground." "I'm already too late with my goats," said Peter slowly. And he stood right where he was, without budging, his hands thrust into his pockets, listening with a grin to Dete's scolding. "Just standing and staring won't get you very far in life," Aunt Dete called to him. "Come here, I've got something nice to show you." She held out to him a penny so new that it flashed in his eyes. Without a word, Peter ran off and tore in a straight line down the hillside. He took such big jumps that he reached the pile of clothing in a short time. He seized it and appeared with it again so quickly that Dete could not help praising him and giving him the promised penny. Like a flash, Peter stuck it deep in his trousers pocket, and his face shone and was wreathed in smiles, for such a treasure did not often come his way. "Now, "Carry this pack to Nuncle's for me, because you're going up there anyway," Auntie Dete said, and they made ready to climb the steep trail that rose straight upward behind the cottage of Goat Peter. The boy did willingly as he was asked, and followed his guide as she strode swiftly on ahead of him. In his left hand he clutched the bundle of clothes. In his right he swung his goat whip. Heidi and the little animals leaped gaily on by his side. In this way, almost an hour later, the small procession arrived at the mountain meadow. Here the cabin of old Meadow Nuncle stood on a great overhanging rock, open to all the winds that blew, but also where every ray of sunshine would strike it, and with a fine view far down into the valley. Behind the hut, 3 old fir trees towered aloft with their long, thick branches, and still farther on, in the rear of the meadow, the trail again wound its way up the mountainside until it reached the old gray cliffs. First the road crossed heights that were rich with grass and plants, then a great patch of tangled shrubs, strewn everywhere with stones, until at last the trail was lost in the bald crags that stood sharply out against the sky. Fast to the cottage on its valley side, Nuncle had nailed a bench. Here he was sitting with a pipe in his mouth and his hands on his knees, looking calmly on as the children, the goats, and Aunt Dete climbed up the trail. Heidi led. She walked right up to the old gentleman, stretched out her hand and said, "Good evening, grandfather."
"Well, well, well, and what does this mean?" Nuncle asked.
He grasped the child's hand and gazed at her from under his bushy eyebrows with a long and rather fierce look. Heidi looked steadily back at him without once winking, for grandfather, with his thick gray eyebrows that grew together in the middle, seemed somehow so strange to her that Heidi had to stare at him quite closely. In the meantime, Dete arrived with Peter, who stood still for a while and waited to see what would happen. "I wish you good day, Nuncle," said Dete, coming forward. "Here I am, bringing you the child of Tobias and Adelheid. Of course you don't recognize her because you haven't seen her since she was a year old."
"And what is the child to do in my house?" the old man asked. "As for you yonder," he called to Peter, "run along with your goats. You're none too early. Take my goats with you."
Peter disappeared at once, for Nuncle had given him a look that was all he wanted. "Heidi's going to stay with you, Nuncle," Dete said. "I guess I've done my share for her these last 4 years. It's now your turn to see what you can do."
"Oh ho," said the old man, and flashed a look at Dete. "And when the child begins to whimper, as silly youngsters will, what am I going to do then?"
"That's your business," Dete said. "There was no one to tell me how to handle the child when she came to me barely a year old, and I already had my hands full looking after mother and myself. I have my own work to go to now, and you're the child's nearest relative. If you can't keep her with you, then you must do whatever you want with her. But it's your fault if anything bad happens to her, and I guess you've got enough to answer for already in that respect." Dete's mind was far from easy in this matter of getting rid of Heidi. That is why she grew so excited and said more than she meant to. At her last words, Nuncle rose up quickly and looked at her, so that she fell back a step or two. He stretched out his arm and said fiercely, "Go back to where you came from, and don't you show up here again." Dete did not wait to be told twice. "Well, goodbye then, Nuncle, and you too, Heidi," she said quickly, and she ran all the way downhill to the hamlet at a fast trot, for her excitement kept driving her on like a steam engine. As she passed through the village this time, she was hailed more often than before, because everyone was wondering what she had done with the child. They were all acquainted with Dete, knew who the child was, and remembered everything that had happened in the past. But when from every door and window the questions flew, "Where's the young child, Dete?" and "Where did you leave the young'un?" she kept answering back ever more and more crossly, "Up at Meadow Nuncle's. Yes, at Meadow Nuncle's, I said. You're not deaf, are you?" The reason she was so rude was that the women on every hand were calling to her, "Oh, how could you do such a thing? And the poor little kitten, and leaving that helpless little mite up there, and the poor angel," over and over again. Dete ran on and on as fast as ever she could, and was glad enough when she finally got out of hearing of their words, for she was not quite easy about the whole business, since her mother on her deathbed had given Heidi over to her care. But she comforted herself with the thought that she could help the child all the more, now that she would be earning good wages, and so she was glad to escape from anybody who argued against her act, and, at last, be on her way to take a good position. Chapter 2. At Grandfather's. After Dete had gone, Nuncle had sat down again on the bench, and now he was blowing great clouds of smoke from his pipe, and all the time he was staring at the ground, and never saying a word. Meanwhile, Heidi looked about her happily. She discovered the goat shed that was built beside the cottage and peered into it. There was nothing inside. The child continued her search and came to the old fir trees behind the hut. There the wind was blowing so hard through the branches that it whistled and roared up in the treetops. Heidi stood still and listened. When it grew a little quieter, the child walked around the other side of the cottage and came back to her grandfather in front. As she found him still in the same position as when she had left him, she placed herself before him, put her hands behind her back, and gazed at him. The grandfather looked up. "What do you want to do now?" he asked, as the child kept standing before him without moving. "I'm going to see what you have in the cottage," said Heidi. "Come on, then." And the grandfather got up and walked ahead of her into the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes along with you," he called to her as she entered. "I don't need them any more," Heidi explained. The old man turned around and looked sharply at the child, whose black eyes were shining as she thought of what would be inside. "She can't be lacking in common sense," he said half to himself. "Why don't you need your clothes any longer?" he added aloud. "I'd soonest go like the goats. They have swift little legs." "And you can too, but get your things," Grandfather told her. "We'll put them in the chest." Heidi did as she was told. The old man now opened the door, and Heidi followed him into a fairly large room, which took up all the space of the cottage. There was a table and a chair beside it. In one corner was the bed where Grandfather slept. In another corner a great kettle hung above the fireplace. On the other side of the room there was a big door in the wall. Grandfather opened it. It led into the cupboard. In there his clothes were hanging. On one shelf lay his shirts, his stockings, and his linen, and on another one were several plates, cups, and glasses, and on the topmost shelf a round loaf of bread, with smoked meat and cheese. Everything the Meadow Nuncle had in the world, and needed for his housekeeping, was in this closet. As soon as he had opened the cupboard, Heidi ran quickly up with her things and thrust them inside as far back of Grandfather's clothes as she could, so they would not be easy to find again. Then she looked carefully around the room and said, "Where must I sleep, Grandfather?" "Where you want to." That just suited Heidi. She hunted in every nook and corner to see which was the best place for her to sleep. Over in the corner, beyond Grandfather's couch, a little ladder was standing. Heidi climbed this and came to the hayloft. There lay a fresh, sweet-smelling heap of hay, and through a round window one could look far down into the valley below. "I want to sleep here," Heidi called down. "It's fine. Just come and see how nice it is here, Grandfather."
"I know well enough,"
came the voice from below. "I'm making the bed now," the child called again, as she moved busily to and fro. "But you must come up and bring me a linen sheet, for there's a sheet on every bed, and that's what you lie on."
"So that's the way, is it?
the grandfather said below, and after a while he went to the cupboard and rummaged around a bit in it. Then he drew out from under his shirts a long, coarse cloth that looked as if it might be something like a sheet. He came up the ladder with it. A very neat little bed had been made up there in the loft. At the top of it, where the head would come, the hay had been piled up high, so that one could look right through the open round window.
"That's done just right," the grandfather said. "Now comes the sheet, but wait a minute."
And he snatched up a good armful of hay from the stack and made the couch twice as thick, so that the hard floor could not be felt through it.
"There, now come here with the sheet."
Heidi had quickly grasped the linen sheet, but it was so heavy that she could almost not carry it. But that was a good thing, too, for then the sharp hay straws could not stick through the firm material. Then the two of them spread the sheet over the hay, and where it was too wide or too long, Heidi hastily stuffed the ends under the bed. At last it looked very trim and neat, and Heidi stood before it and looked at it thoughtfully. "There's one thing we've forgotten, grandfather," she said.
"What can that be?" he asked.
"A coverlet, for when you go to bed, you creep in between the sheet and the coverlet."
"Oh, you do? But what if I haven't got one?" the old man said.
"That's all right then, grandfather," Heidi said gently. "We can take some more hay for our coverlet." And she started to go to the haymow again. But grandfather put up his hand.
"Wait a minute," he said,
and climbed down the ladder and walked over to his couch. Then he came back with a large, heavy linen sack and laid it on the floor.
"Isn't that better than hay?" he asked.
Heidi tugged at the bag as hard as ever she could to unfold it, but her little hands could not master the heavy material. Grandfather helped, and when at last it was spread out on the bed, everything looked quite neat. Heidi stood admiring her new couch and said, "That is a splendid coverlet, and the whole bed is beautiful, and now I only wish it was night, so I could lie down on it."
"I think we'd better have something to eat first," said grandfather. "Is that your idea?"
Heidi had been so excited about making the bed that she had forgotten everything else. But now that she came to think about food, she at once grew very hungry, for she had had nothing except a piece of bread and a small cup of thin tea early that morning, and since that time she had made a long journey. So she said very heartily, "Yes, that's my idea too."
"Go down then, since we're both agreed," said the old man, and he followed right on her heels.
Then he went to the kettle, pushed the big one aside, and drew forward the small one that hung on the chain, and sat down before it on the three-legged wooden stool with the round seat, and blew the fire into flames. The water in the kettle began to boil, and below it the old man held a large piece of cheese on the end of a long iron fork over the fire, turning it this way and that until it was as yellow as gold on every side. All this Heidi had watched eagerly. Suddenly, a new thought had come into her mind, for she ran off to the cupboard and kept going back and forth. Then grandfather brought the teapot and the toasted cheese to the table. It was already neatly set with the round loaf of bread on it, and 2 plates and 2 knives. For Heidi had quickly found where everything was in the closet, and knew that it would be all needed right away for the meal.
"That's nice you think things out for yourself," said the grandfather, as he laid the cheese down on the bread. "But there's something still lacking from the table."
Heidi saw how invitingly the steam was coming out of the teapot, and quickly ran back to the cupboard. But there was only a single small bowl to be seen. Heidi was not at a loss for long, as 2 glasses were standing right behind it. The child came back at once, and set the bowl and a glass on the table.
"That's the way. You know how to help yourself. But where are you going to sit?"
Grandfather was himself sitting on the only chair. Heidi ran straight as an arrow to the fireplace, brought back the little 3-legged stool, and sat down on it.
"Well, "That's a seat for you at any rate," the grandfather said. "Only it's a good way down. But my chair would be too short for you to reach the table too. And yet, you must have something to eat, so come ahead."
Thereupon he got up, filled the small bowl with milk, set it on his chair, and drew this quite close to the stool, so that Heidi now had a table before her. Grandfather laid a big slice of bread and a piece of the golden cheese on the chair and said,
"Eat away."
He sat down on a corner of the table and began his own noonday meal. Heidi seized her bowl and drank without stopping, for all the thirst from her long journey had returned to her. Then she drew a long breath, for she had been drinking so hard she couldn't breathe for a long time, and set down her bowl.
"Do you like the milk?"
Grandfather asked. "I never drank such good milk in all my life," Heidi answered.
"Then you must take some more."
And Grandfather filled the bowl to the very top again, and placed it before the child, who was eating happily away at her bread after this had been spread with the soft cheese, for the cheese had been toasted until it was as soft as butter, and it tasted very good indeed. She took frequent sips of milk, and seemed quite content. When the meal was ended, Grandfather went out to the goat shed and was busy putting it in order, and Heidi watched carefully as he first swept it out with a broom, and then scattered fresh straw for the animals to sleep on. She followed him later into the shop next door, where he cut round sticks and shaped up a board. He bored holes in it, put in the round sticks and set it up, and there was suddenly a chair like Grandfather's, only much higher. Heidi stared at the thing, speechless with wonder.
"What is that, Heidi?"
her grandfather asked. That's my chair because it's so high." "You did it like lightning," said the child, not yet able to get over her surprise.
"She knows what things are. Her eyes are in the right place,"
her grandfather muttered to himself as he walked around the cottage and drove a nail here and there. Then he fixed something about the door and wandered from one place to another with hammer and nails and pieces of wood, patching or knocking things off, just as seemed best. Heidi followed his every step, watching him closely, and everything he did seemed to amuse her. Thus the evening drew near. There was a louder rustling in the old fir trees, and a mighty wind came along and whistled and roared in the thick treetops. It sounded so beautiful in Heidi's ears that it made her very happy. She hopped and danced about outside under the firs, as if some strange joy had come to her. Grandfather stood in the doorway of the shop and watched her play. Then a shrill whistle was heard. Heidi put a stop to her jumping. Grandfather stepped outside. Down from above, goat after goat came leaping like a pack of hunters, and Peter in their midst. With a cry of joy, Heidi rushed into the midst of the flock, and one after another greeted her friends of the morning. When the flock reached the hut, they all came to a halt, and 2 fine slender goats, one white and one brown, came up to Grandfather and licked his hands, for he had some salt in them to welcome them with, as he did every evening. Peter disappeared with his troop. Heidi stroked very gently first one goat and then the other, running around to pat them on the other side. She was quite mad about the small creatures. "Are they ours, Grandfather? Are they both ours? Do they go into the shed? Are they to stay with us always?" Heidi asked one question after another in her excitement, so that Grandfather could hardly get a word in edgewise.
"Yes, yes, yes," he said.
And when the goats had licked up all their salt, he added,
"Go and bring out your bowl and the bread."
Heidi did as she was told and came right back. Then Grandfather milked the white goat and filled the little bowl with its milk and cut off a slice of bread.
"Now eat your supper," he said, "and then run off to bed. Your Auntie Dete left a bundle for you. There are some nightgowns and other things in it. You'll find it downstairs in the chest when you need it. I must go and see to the goats now, so sleep well."
"Good night, Grandfather. Good night. Oh, "Oh, what are their names, Grandfather? What do you call them?" the child cried as she ran after the old man and the goats, who were disappearing into the shed.
"The white one's name is Little Swan. The brown one is called Little Bear," Grandfather answered.
"Good night, Schweinli. Good night, Bearly," Heidi called with all her might, because they were just vanishing into the stable. Then she settled down on the bench and ate her bread and drank her milk, although the wind was so strong that it almost blew her from her seat. So she finished as fast as she could and went in to climb up to bed. And she went right off to sleep and slept as soundly as if she were lying on the most beautiful bed of some princess. Not long afterward, before it was yet wholly dark, Grandfather, too, lay down upon his couch, for he was always up with the sun mornings, and it peered over the mountain top very early in the summertime. During the night the wind blew with such force that it made the whole cottage tremble, and all the beams were creaking. It howled and groaned in the chimney, like the voice of one in pain, and outside in the fir trees it raged so terribly that here and there a branch was broken off. In the middle of the night, Grandfather got out of bed and said to himself softly, "She is probably scared." So he climbed up the ladder and went to Heidi's side. Out of doors the moon was shining brightly just then, but a moment later it hid again behind the driving clouds, and all was dark. Then the moonlight shone a second time clearly through the round opening and fell right on Heidi's bed. Her cheeks were as red as fire from sleeping under the heavy coverlet. She lay quite peaceful and still on one round little arm, and was dreaming of something pleasant, for a look of happiness was on her small face. Grandfather stood a long time to gaze at the gently sleeping child, until the moon again went behind a cloud, and it was dark. Then he returned to his own couch. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.